With over 30 games in the franchise, Resident Evil is clearly the frontrunner when it comes to the longest running horror franchise in video game history, and that's excluding all of the crappy mobile games out there. From classic fixed camera survival horror to action focused titles all the way down to PvP multiplayer games. Resident Evil has truly been all over the place over the last 3 decades since the first game of the series released back in 1996. So what better way to celebrate Resident Evil as it inches closer and closer to its 30th anniversary next year than to give you guys my personal rankings of the entire RE franchise. For the record, today's video will include all 30 Resident Evil games, ranging from the mainline entries to the spin-off games and even the remakes of the series. I will, however, not be including any of those mobile games, mainly because most of them I haven't played, and the ones I have, well, let's just say they're not all that great. Also, on that note, I won't be including additional ports or remasters of the same game. For example, while Resident Evil 2002 and RE Deadly Silence will be featured in today's video as they stand out enough from the original game, the Origins HD Collection and Resident Evil Director's Cut will not be a separate entry on today's list. Makes sense? Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is every Resident Evil game ranked from worst to best. Let's get it. Number 30, Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica. If you asked anybody out there, most people would probably go with a different entry as the worst RE game, which I'm sure you could guess which one that is. For me personally though, Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica is the worst of the entire RE franchise. Don't get me wrong, if you're playing this game in the middle of an arcade with a friend, then I can definitely see how it could be fun for some people. Unfortunately, this gameplay style is just done better in both the Resident Evil franchise and the Gun Survivor series. Dino Stalker, a Dino Crisis themed Gun Survivor game, is a better arcade experience, and the other on-rail shooters of Resident Evil, Darkside and Umbrella Chronicles, handles the mechanics in a much better way. To make matters worse, Survivor 2 takes the story of Code Veronica, turns it into a dream sequence that Claire is experiencing, and then screws with the lore of the game by featuring Nemesis chasing after Claire and Steve. Number 29, The Umbrella Corps. You know a Resident Evil game is going to be bad when Capcom themselves are like, hell no, we are not putting the RE name on this one. Yeah, believe it or not, The Umbrella Corps is the only game on today's list that actually doesn't even have the Resident Evil name in the title. And for good reason, this game absolutely blows. This game takes everything you know about the Resident Evil franchise, throws it out of a window, then takes popular trends of multiplayer games during the PlayStation 4 era, and makes one of the most generic PvP games out there, but slaps the Umbrella logo on it in the hopes that Resident Evil fans will make them the big bucks. Except for one problem, the game fucking sucks. This game was just a really bad game no matter how you looked at it. The unlockable cosmetics of the game sucked. PvP had some really big issues in terms of the balancing, mainly courtesy of that damn melee weapon, the Brainer, and the single player campaign of the game, if you could call it that, outstays its welcome because of how bad it is, even if it's only an hour long. Seriously, I wish I could give you some positives, but there really are not that many good things I could say about this game. I guess fighting the opposite team with zombies roaming around is kind of unique. Seeing different iconic set pieces from the Resident Evil universe is nostalgic, and as with many bad multiplayer games, it could be fun with friends, sometimes. But I'm sorry, you have to really hate your friends to make them play through this dumpster fire, just saying. Number 28, Resident Evil Reverse. Okay, Reverse may not get a lot of love from the fan base, but at least it didn't charge us $40 at launch like the Umbrella Corps did. In fact, Reverse was free to play if you purchased Resident Evil Village. And let's be real, anybody that would play a free-for-all PvP Resident Evil game would more than likely have purchased the next mainline Resident Evil game. Still, even for no additional cost for those that owned Village, Reverse was still a massive letdown. I don't know why Capcom has so much trouble recognizing what fans want from a live service Resident Evil game. Just give us a modern day Resident Evil Outbreak and I promise you, us RE fans would eat that up. Instead, Reverse is a free-for-all that essentially pits the player against other players using iconic survivors from the Resident Evil universe, including Leon Kennedy, Claire Redfield, and Jill Valentine. The unique trait to the gameplay is that when you die, depending on how many vials you have collected, you'll transform into one of the iconic infected monsters of the Resident Evil franchise. Again, on paper, this sounds actually pretty cool, and for a very short while, it was a little fun. Problem is, with most live service games that don't have a consistent player base, the game didn't receive a lot of updates and it was very limited on content. There were a total of 3 levels, the RPD station, the Baker Estate, and the village from Resident Evil Village. There were only a handful of characters to choose from, half of which was made up of faceless characters on Chris's Houndwolf squad. And that kind of fun mechanic I mentioned earlier regarding how you change into an iconic monster after you die had a total of 5 different monsters that you could change into. Yeah, it was a massive letdown, especially when considering the potential that this game actually had. To make matters worse, servers for Reverse will be shutting down this June after releasing in October 2022. Number 27, Resident Evil Gaiden. There's a total of 2 Resident Evil games out of the entire RE franchise in which the player gets to play as the man that loves his Jill sandwiches, Barry Burton. One of which was Resident Evil Gaiden, a Game Boy Color exclusive that follows returning protagonist Barry Burton and Leon S. Kennedy as they explore a creepy ship full of zombies and other infected monsters. With returning characters and the main enemy type being zombies, it sounds like your traditional Resident Evil game, right? Except that it actually wasn't. Unlike any game that came before it, Resident Evil Gaiden had a completely different gameplay style to it, in which it would allow the player to explore the ship as if they were in the overworld of a turn-based JRPG, and then after interacting with an enemy, they would enter into some sort of rhythm game. Seriously, I can't make this shit up. Despite the goofy story and the random and unsatisfying gameplay mechanics, Gaiden wasn't all that bad, and it actually was a bit entertaining to see how it all played out. Spoilers for a 24-year-old game, Gaiden did have a pretty hilarious ending in which the real Leon S. Kennedy is actually replaced by a ship-shifting BOW that bleeds green, and Barry Burton adopts an orphan that was used in biological experiments. Hey, wait a second. Number 26, Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. Unlike the Umbrella Corps, Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City actually took place during the events of RE2 and RE3, but follows the perspective of Umbrella's security service. This on its own is 1, already more than anything the Umbrella Corps does with its storytelling, and 2, has a better premise that not only connects it to the Resident Evil universe, but sets it up to connect with different RE characters, monsters, and iconic locations within Raccoon City. With a premise like this, it's kind of hard not to mess things up, right? Well, again, not exactly. While the game definitely is leaps and bounds better than the Umbrella Corps, there are still some major flaws that keep it from moving up higher on this list. The main characters of the game are bland and even unlikable. Even though we get to revisit iconic locations in Raccoon City, the set pieces are still a bit lackluster. And the gameplay is extremely clunky and hard to get used to. Still, despite saying all of that, while Operation Raccoon City might not be a good game, it's hard to deny the fact that it's actually still a fun game. Getting the chance to play through the events of the Raccoon City outbreak, but from the perspective of an Umbrella agent, allows you to feel like a true badass as you are mowing down zombies and iconic monsters from the Resident Evil universe. And it's kind of cool to interact with different Resident Evil characters throughout both games in a different and unique way. Sure, I'm not a fan of the whole kill or save Leon and Claire at the end of the game, but for the most part, Operation Raccoon City is one of those really bad games that are just a lot of fun to play when you turn your mind off, of course. Number 25, Resident Evil Survivor. Whereas Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica feels like a traditional arcade game that is a non-canon dream sequence based on the original Code Veronica, the first Survivor game is actually an original story that is proven to be canon thanks to the intro of Resident Evil 0. Following Ark Thompson, a private investigator sent to Sheena Island by fan favorite Leon S. Kennedy, the player must battle through zombies and other monsters in order to recover Ark's memory after he crash lands on the island while trying to escape. Unlike the original trilogy, Resident Evil Survivor is a first-person light gun shooter while also having some minor traits of survival horror, including limited resources and inventory management. Throughout the game, you'll come across iconic monsters seen in the original trilogy, including Lickers, Hunters, and even Mr. X. Despite being a departure from what we are familiar with, Survivor was a relatively fun experience once you got past the boring story and extremely bad dialogue. Sure, bad dialogue and voice acting is not really anything new for older Resident Evil games, but when the game makes the original Resident Evil trilogy look Oscar-worthy, yeah, clearly there's a problem here.
Put that down. I won't harm you. I promise.
Liar. You'll kill me if I drop it. I'm not stupid. Now stay back. Don't come any closer.
Number 24, Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D. After the popularity of the Mercenaries in Resident Evil 5, it was only a matter of time before Capcom would try to cash in on the hype by developing an entire game based on the Mercenaries. And while Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D was just as fun as the bonus game of the same name in Resident Evil 5, there was one major flaw that ultimately brought this game down: the lack of content. See, with an entire game built around a free-to-play bonus game that has appeared in previous Resident Evil games, Capcom would need to find new and exciting ways to keep the game exciting and worth a $40 price tag without it feeling repetitive. For example, featuring different modes, more levels, and different characters, each with their own unique skill set that it would make tackling each level with them feel completely unique from each other. And while the Mercenaries 3D did do this to a certain degree, it was far less than ideal for a $40 game. I'm not saying Mercenaries 3D was a bad game, because it wasn't. It was a lot of fun to play. But considering that we only got a little more content than what we got in Resident Evil 5's free-to-play Mercenaries mode, but on the 3DS, then yeah, it was a major disappointment. This could have easily been fixed if Capcom wasn't so greedy and rushed this game out to cash in on the Mercenaries hype. For example, by including more exciting levels and more fan favorite characters like, I don't know, Leon S. fucking Kennedy, then this could have had longer legs and fans would have appreciated this game a lot more. Unfortunately, despite the really fun gameplay experience, the lack of content in the game keeps me from moving it up any higher on today's list than number 24. Number 23, Resident Evil Resistance. Resistance might very well be the closest thing us RE fans will ever get to a modern day Resident Evil Outbreak game. This asymmetrical game pits 4 survivors against 1 mastermind. The goal of the survivors is pretty simple: battle through the different infected and monsters of the Resident Evil universe and escape with your team. The goal of the mastermind was also simple: kill the survivors at all costs using the weapons and BOWs at your disposal. Resistance is technically not a standalone game, but rather a bonus game, and for that reason I heavily debated about including it on today's list. But I felt like it had enough traits and content to stand out on its own, and because of that I decided to include it so that we could round off today's list with a big 30 instead of 29. Sounds better, you know. Still, Resistance is actually a really fun experience. I think the reason why it gets so much slack though is because Capcom tried using this game as a way to justify the lack of content in the main story of RE3 Remake and its $60 price tag. Still, with a little more polishing, and if Capcom didn't give up on supporting this game so fast and continued to bring new masterminds and survivors to the game, Resident Evil Resistance really could have been the perfect live service Resident Evil game that Capcom has been chasing for so long now. Number 22, Resident Evil: The Dark Side Chronicles. I have no problem admitting that on-rail shooters are just not for me, especially when playing them on console instead of playing them at an arcade. Despite saying that though, the Chronicle games of the Resident Evil franchise were both fun experiences. As you can see, I found the Dark Side Chronicles weaker of the 2 entries. Starting with the positives though, Dark Side Chronicles finally allows us to understand Krauser's and Leon's relationship prior to the events of RE4. In this game, we follow Leon and Krauser as they battle a dangerous individual known as Javier Hidalgo, who has somehow got his hands on the Veronica virus. Yeah, the same virus used in Resident Evil Code Veronica. Because Leon is one of the main protagonists of the game, and because of the connection that the Veronica virus has to the Rockford Island and Umbrella's Antarctic base incidents, the Dark Side Chronicles retells the events of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil Code Veronica. I can nitpick different aspects of each Chronicles game, but ultimately there's 2 major reasons why Dark Side Chronicles is lower on today's list than its predecessor. The first being because of the gameplay experience. While visually it is more impressive, the way the camera jolts back and forth and moves around from scene to scene compared to its predecessor feels a bit more jerky and at times causes me to get motion sickness. The other reason is because of the additional story scenarios of each game. While Darkseid does provide more info on Krauser's backstory, and honestly we get a better version of Steve Burnside in this game compared to Code Veronica, these pros are outweighed by the multiple additional pieces of information introduced to us in the Umbrella Chronicles. Number 21, Resident Evil Dead Aim. I was actually pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed the gameplay side of things when it came to Dead Aim when I got around to replaying it recently. Sure, the story is ridiculous and it feels completely out of place for a Resident Evil game based on the story alone. But once you get past the ludicrous story, Dead Aim has one of the more unique gameplay experiences of the series while still feeling somewhat familiar to the Resident Evil veterans. For example, you'll still have inventory management, limited resources, and even save rooms with typewriters complete with its own save room music. Anyway, while you're exploring the ship, you're in third person, as you have to find key items to unlock new locations and proceed farther into the game. However, whenever you encounter enemies, you'll need to switch to first person that resembles a light gun shooter, sort of. I'll admit it takes some getting used to, but once you get the hang of it, the game plays pretty well for its time, and it's one of the better spin-off games of the series. It even does a great job at nailing the atmosphere of a Resident Evil game despite taking it in a different direction with the gameplay mechanics. Number 20, Resident Evil Revelations 2. As the first non-numbered mainline entry of the series to appear on this list, Resident Evil Revelations 2 ranks as the worst mainline entry of the entire series through my eyes. Now, some of you that have been fans of the channel for the past 2 years might point out how Resident Evil 6 used to claim that title, but after doing some soul searching and replaying both of these games very recently, and the fact that I had a little more fun playing the game with my good friend Conjure Lion, I finally realized that I would rather revisit Resident Evil 6 over Revelations 2 any day. Now, that's not to say Revelations 2 is a bad game, as I don't think there are any mainline entries of the Resident Evil franchise that are bad enough to be called a bad game. However, Revelations 2 misses the beat on multiple occasions. Like, for example, the game lacks the tension and atmospheric horror vibes of its predecessor that was on the Nintendo 3DS, for crying out loud. Yeah, a 3DS game was much more intense and terrifying than this game. The boss fights were pretty lackluster, and the enemy types, while scary looking, felt a bit one-dimensional. Not to mention, we've already seen the whole trapped on an island bit in previous games, and guess what? It was done better in all of those games. Add that to the annoying mechanics of the player that controlled either Natalia or Myra, and the episodic release of the game that ultimately ruined the immersion of the story, and the uninteresting characters outside of returning characters Claire Redfield and Barry Burton, and it's not too surprising to see why this game ranks as low as it does for me. But hey, the raid mode is fire as hell. I'll give it that. Number 19, Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles. Unlike Darkside Chronicles, Umbrella Chronicles focuses on Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil, and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. We got to revisit iconic set pieces in each of these games, but from the perspective of an on-rail shooter instead of the traditional fixed camera gameplay experience that we were used to. However, where the game truly shines and surpasses Darkside Chronicles are the new stories within each game that explores unsolved mysteries that us RE fans had been wondering about after playing each of those games. For example, the Umbrella Chronicles would show us what Rebecca Chambers did in between the events of Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil, how Ada Wong made her grand escape after separating from Leon in RE2, and it would also show us how Wesker escaped the Spencer Mansion after being impaled by the Tyrant at the end of the first game. Most importantly though, we would get an additional scenario in the Umbrella Chronicles that would be our direct link to Umbrella's downfall in the form of Jill and Chris infiltrating Umbrella's final base located in Russia. Considering that the gameplay feels more smoother than that of its sequel and the extremely satisfying payoffs that we would get in the additional lore department, Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles is an extremely satisfying spin-off entry that adds new things and new perspectives to our favorite Resident Evil stories. Number 18, Resident Evil 6. RE6 is regarded by some fans as the worst numbered entry of the entire RE franchise, and for good reason. RE6 takes everything that the series has learned over the years, throws it all in one giant pot, mixes it together, and then serves it lukewarm. See, Resident Evil 6 is the perfect example of fan service gone bad. The game was broken down into 4 different campaigns, each following a returning Resident Evil character: Leon Kennedy, Chris Redfield, Sherry Birkin, and Ada Wong. While their stories do connect with each other, each campaign was essentially a single story from the perspective of one of the fan favorite characters. The main issue with that is that unlike previous games, each of these campaigns were actually being developed by different teams. This is why each campaign felt vastly different from each other. For example, Leon Kennedy would have more horror vibes with the inclusion of traditional zombies. Chris Redfield's campaign would feel like a Gears of War meets Call of Duty campaign. Jake and Cherry's campaign would also be action focused, but complete with a major focus on melee mechanics thanks to Jake's martial arts skills. And finally, Ada Wong will feel like your traditional action spy game. While on paper this might seem great and all, it unfortunately just doesn't work. At least not for a Resident Evil game. Because the main characters are constantly traveling all around the world, you never really get a sense of adrenaline that you normally would get from the atmospheric horror vibes of earlier games. The action would far outweigh the horror in this game compared to every other mainline entry of the series. The enemy types are arguably the worst of the franchise, with most of them being pale imitations of previous monsters of the Resident Evil universe. And outside of a few notable moments in the game, the story is extremely long, boring, predictable, and lackluster in comparison to other entries of the series. There are some shining moments that keep it from falling lower on today's list, including one of the best mercenaries mode in a Resident Evil game to date. The fact that this game is actually a lot of fun on co-op. Pierce Nibbins is without a doubt the MVP of the game, and the fact that the combat is actually smoother than the previous entries of the action trilogy, Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5. But unfortunately, the cons far outweighs the pros in Resident Evil 6's case. Number 17, Resident Evil Revelations. Revelations was one of the more surprising games released on the Nintendo 3DS, as not only was it scarier than most games on the console, it actually played relatively well. Considering that the game would bring Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine back together once again, leading to the events of RE5, fans were more than excited for this next entry of the Resident Evil franchise. For the most part, Revelations actually nailed the tension and horrifying feeling of being trapped on a cruise ship better than any of the other games of the series that were set on a cruise ship. Considering that the other games that took place on a ship include Resident Evil Gaiden and Dead Aim though, I suppose that's not really saying much, is it? Still, the first half of the game, from where Jill and Parker infiltrate the ship all the way down to when they are confronted by the Skagdead in the cafeteria, Revelations felt scarier than most of the Resident Evil games released around the same time. That is until the story took a drastic turn as it would begin to lean towards other subgenres, including comedy and espionage. The first is a bigger issue as two characters would eventually get introduced in the game, Quint and Keith. These guys are absolutely ridiculous, and honestly, every time they were on screen, I wanted to stop playing the game right away. I don't know why Capcom thought it needed some sort of comedic relief, and I definitely don't understand why it had to be these guys that provided it. The other aspect of the game that would weigh down the horror vibes of Revelations is the fact that it would feel like a spy movie at times. Multiple times you'll get the whole double agent, no wait, triple agent moment, complete with I thought you were dead situations again and again, and it would become laughably bad by the time the post-credits scene plays out. Still, get through the story and you have a relatively interesting game with terrifying ooze-like monsters, dangerous bosses like the Skagdead and Ultimate Abyss, and a setting that rivals other settings seen in the Resident Evil franchise. Oh, and Chris and Jill are together again. You gotta love that. Number 16, Resident Evil 5. If RE4 was the game that set the franchise on the path towards action horror, Resident Evil 5 was the game that took the ball and ran with it. While RE6 is clearly more action, RE5 was the first to completely dump every bit of horror vibes that was somewhat present in RE4 and focus on making a fun game. And for the most part, Resident Evil 5 was just that, a fun game. The gameplay mechanics were smoother and better than RE4, even if the game featured more QTEs. The setting, while controversial, was nothing like anything we've seen before in previous games. Although, on that same note, while different, none of the areas of RE5 really stood out as being as iconic as other set pieces throughout the franchise. And we got to see the reunion of the OG STARS members themselves, Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and even Albert Wesker. Hell, if you threw Rebecca and Barry in there, then we could have had the collection complete. The boss fights were also really interesting and challenging, and the cutscenes are some of the best of the series. The flashback sequence where Chris and Jill fight Wesker is still to this day my favorite cutscene in the entire Resident Evil series. Hell, even the Sheva and Chris versus Wesker short cutscene was pretty badass. Not to mention co-op in this game was incredible. Hell, I would argue that co-op in Resident Evil 5 is the best it's ever been. Of course, that also plays into a negative as well, the AI. While co-op is fantastic, the AI of your partner when playing alone is extremely frustrating. In fact, I think the AI was the cause of my death more than any other enemy in the game when I first played it. Number 15, Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2. The Resident Evil Outbreak games were far beyond its time. It was an online co-op experience in which you would team up with 1 to 3 other players to escape different scenarios in Raccoon City during the events of RE2 and RE3. Unfortunately, because it was on the PlayStation 2 one generation early before online co-op would become popular, the Outbreak games never really got all of the attention that they deserve. In fact, the financial failure of this game, Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2, would lead to Capcom canceling development on the third Outbreak game. Now, to be fair, Outbreak Number 2 released the same year as RE4, and clearly that game was on a whole other level than the Outbreak games. On top of that, while some features were improved on, for the most part, Outbreak Number 2 was exactly like its predecessor, except that it took place in different parts of Raccoon City. The reason why I put Outbreak Number 2 slightly lower than its predecessor comes from the fact that 1, despite it being a sequel, it really didn't do anything innovative to help it stand out from its predecessor, and 2, I just didn't like most of Outbreak 2 scenarios compared to the first game. Wild Things set in the Raccoon City Zoo was probably the highlight of the game, but just about every other scenario in this game fell flat for me in comparison to the first game. Which brings me to the next entry on today's list. Number 14, Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 1. I decided to keep the Outbreak games side by side because essentially they are two halves of the same game. In fact, the original plan for Outbreak was to release a single game that featured somewhere between 15 to 20 scenarios. However, Capcom changed that, and the new plan was to feature Outbreak in 3 separate files. As I said earlier, we never got to see the release of Outbreak Files Number 3 after the second game flopped, while Resident Evil 4 went on to become one of the highest selling horror games of all time. Anyway, everything said about Outbreak 2 still applies here with 2 exceptions. 1, Outbreak Files Number 1 didn't have to compete with the juggernaut that was RE4. And because it was still new and fresh, Outbreak File Number 1 felt like something new within one of the most interesting moments of the Resident Evil franchise, the Raccoon City Outbreak. As I said earlier, players could play online with people to escape Raccoon City in different locations. The first game, at least in my opinion, featured more interesting scenarios. Obviously the Outbreak scenario is the most memorable one, but my personal favorite was the Hellfire scenario, as it's my favorite scenario between both games. A majority of this scenario finds you inside of an apartment building that is on fire, and eventually you'll find yourself against one of the more unnerving Resident Evil monsters ever, the Suspended. This monster was essentially an abomination that was in between the transition phase of a zombie turning into a licker. I think the one thing that sets both Outbreak games from moving higher on this list is due to the fact that it didn't have a lot of replayability to it, and on top of that, the controls were pretty outdated. Like, I love me some fixed camera angles complete with tank controls, but Outbreak File number 1 and File number 2 both felt way too clunky for my taste. But hey, becoming a zombie and chasing down my friends is still one of the most fun experiences that I've ever had in the Resident Evil franchise. Love that feature. Number 13, Resident Evil 3 Remake. I'm kind of screwed with this entry because no matter where I rank this game, someone is going to be pretty damn upset with me. People that hate RE3 Remake and think it's the worst game of the entire franchise are going to be pissed to see that I put it so high up. Meanwhile, defenders of the game are also going to be annoyed with me for putting it so low. Here's the thing, I definitely don't hate RE3 Remake. In fact, I like it to a certain extent. Yes, the game is a bad remake thanks to it removing so many key features from the original game, including the clock tower and the gravedigger. Despite saying that though, I still think RE3 Remake is still a fun game once you stop comparing it to the original. Turn your mind off for 1 second and you'll see that there's a lot to appreciate about this game. Carlos is leaps and bounds better in this version of the game compared to the original. And even though some people would disagree with me, Jill Valentine in RE3 Remake is still to this day my favorite version of Jill. I even like the combat in this game and how addicting the dodge mechanic is to use. While the game is much shorter compared to the original, I still found myself playing this game a lot because of how much fun I have playing it. With that being said, this game is nowhere near as good as the original. Probably the biggest crime outside of the cut content of the game is Nemesis. The dude is just a joke in this game. Even comparing him to RE2 Remake's version of Mr. X, that guy was far more intimidating and unpredictable than that of Nemesis in RE3 Remake. I'm also upset about the lack of puzzles in this game, especially considering that RE3 Nemesis is to this day the hardest game of the franchise in terms of the puzzle difficulty. All in all, I like Resident Evil 3 Remake. Do I love it? Not really. Do I think it's better than the original? Absolutely not. But still a game that I find to be a pretty damn good time every now and then, and yeah, I love me some RE3 Remake Jill Valentine. Sue me.
Next time, take the fucking hit!
Number 12, Resident Evil Deadly Silence. I debated including this game on today's list as it could be described as a port of the original Resident Evil game. However, with all of the changes made to the gameplay and the experience as a whole, especially thanks to the rebirth mode, I felt like it would be a damn crime to not feature Deadly Silence as its own entry on today's list. Now, for a lot of people that actually played Deadly Silence on the DS, they'd probably argue that this is the ideal way to play the original Resident Evil game, excluding the 2002 remake, of course. And while I can definitely see why that is, I don't know, something about the charm of the original game on the PlayStation 1 just really has me hooked. Still, Deadly Silence has way more features and new gameplay mechanics that make it stand out from any other version of the first RE game. As I mentioned, most of the iconic new features are in a new mode introduced in Deadly Silence, Rebirth mode. In this mode, more enemies would be added all across the Spencer Mansion, making combat a lot less avoidable and a lot more tense. Sure, it does make it feel a little less scary and a little more action, but hey, it was still a really fun and new way to experience the classic. Since there's a lot more enemies though, obviously Rebirth mode makes up for that by giving you a lot more resources, making it easier to go guns blazing in the Spencer Mansion. However, one of the weirdest and surprisingly fun new features in Rebirth mode is the first-person combat knife mechanic. When confronted by enemies in Rebirth mode, you can use the combat knife and enter first-person mode, in which you'll use the stylus to hack and slash your way to victory. Kind of cheesy, but really fun too. Plus you get new puzzles that use the capabilities of the touchscreen to solve, new costumes, and other new features that make this version of Resident Evil one of the more unique and fun ways to play through the original nightmare. Number 11, Resident Evil Village. Just barely missing out on the top 10 of today's list, we turn our attention to Resident Evil Village. In the past, I've been pretty damn hard on this game, mainly because I was so disappointed with how far it moved away from the horror-focused Resident Evil 7 and how much it leaned towards action horror in this installment. However, since its release, I've come to appreciate this game a little more over time. I do personally believe that Resident Evil Village has one of the better stories of the franchise. See, Resident Evil is not really known for the stories in each game. It's usually all about the gameplay. With that being said, Village told a deeper and more tragic story that closes the Winter Saga in one of the most satisfying ways possible. It also sets up the future of the series, although I'm not too confident that Capcom will use this cliffhanger considering how many cliffhangers they've ignored in the past. Looking at you, Revelations 2. From a gameplay side of things, Village is way more flexible and fluent compared to its predecessor, RE7. That's both good and bad. Good because it allows the player to have more control in different situations, which is ideal considering the fact that you'll be fighting a lot more enemies than you did in RE7. Bad because, well, as I said earlier, it pushes the game in a more action-focused experience. The bosses of the game are also some of the best in the entire series, falling behind only a few other games of the series including Resident Evil 4. And there are some terrifying moments in this game despite it being more action-focused. The basement section in House Beneviento, the first encounter with a Lycan, and in Castle Dimitrescu when you are being chased by Lady D are examples of where this game does dive a little bit back into its horror roots. I am pretty disappointed in the lack of limited saves in Village of Shadows difficulty, whereas RE7 Madhouse mode allowed it to feel more like a traditional survival horror game, and the lack of an item box and resource management also took away a few points for me. But all in all, Village was a fun game, just not one of my favorites since it strayed too far away from survival horror, which in my opinion is what Resident Evil should focus on going forward. Number 10, Resident Evil 0. Hell yeah, we're finally in the top 10 best Resident Evil games of all time, and we're starting it with a game that has slowly moved up on my rankings over the last year, Resident Evil 0. I don't know what has happened to me over the last year, but I've become a bigger Rebecca fanboy than I have ever been in the past. Maybe the CGI movies are helping with that. Either way, RE0 is a controversial pick for being this high up due to how many fans hate this game, and I totally understand why it gets the hate that it does. The lack of an item box and the inclusion of a drop item mechanic created a lot more backtracking, even in comparison to other Resident Evil games, which is kind of saying a lot. The boss fights of RE0 are arguably the worst in the mainline entries, mainly because each enemy literally just sits around and lets you shoot it until it dies. And because of enemies like the Eliminators and the Leech Zombies, RE0 had a much higher difficulty curve than that of most RE games out there. Despite saying all of that though, Resident Evil 0 is still one of the last traditional survival horror games of the RE franchise, and it has almost everything that you love about the classic games of the series, minus a few changes. Inventory management, limited resources, fixed camera angles, iconic set pieces, atmospheric horror, creepy monster designs, an amazing soundtrack, and difficult puzzles. On top of that, Rebecca Chambers is a true badass in this game, even if it doesn't exactly match the Rebecca that we got in RE1. And while I'm normally not a fan of two characters sticking with each other throughout the game because it takes away from the alone by yourself horror vibes, the character change feature between Billy and Rebecca was actually done pretty well, especially when you would need to learn how to use it to solve certain puzzles. Honestly though, I probably prefer two separate campaigns for these characters if RE0 ever got a remake, but that's just a personal preference. Number 9, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. As stated earlier, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a far better game than its 2020 remake. Set before, during, and even after the events of RE2, RE3 Nemesis follows returning STARS member Jill Valentine as she attempts to escape Raccoon City while a new BOW threat, Nemesis, is hot on her heels. The main selling point of this game is the fact that the player actually gets to explore different locations within Raccoon City, from the streets to the clock tower to the park. There's so much that this game did differently than its predecessors, but shockingly, all of these new features really worked well with Resident Evil. While Mr. X was featured briefly as a stalker enemy in Scenario B of RE2, it was Nemesis of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis that really put stalker enemies on the map for years to come. In fact, so many games would build their entire gameplay mechanics around stalker enemies because of how intense Nemesis was in Resident Evil 3. I also mentioned this earlier, but Resident Evil 3 Nemesis by far has the most difficult puzzles of the entire series, something that I personally appreciate in my survival horror games. Just to name a few, you have the water sample puzzle, the clocks puzzle, the music box, and the vaccine synthesizer, all which are more challenging than just about any other puzzle in the Resident Evil series. Jill Valentine felt like a completely different person than she was in RE1. While I personally prefer RE3 Remake Jill, this Jill Valentine still felt like a badass who didn't have to rely on someone to save her. No offense RE1 Jill fans. Hell, the girl has one of the most badass quotes in the entire series in this game.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
Resident Evil 3 Nemesis also featured a new live selection feature that would increase replayability. This was a feature that would allow the player to make important decisions throughout the game that would ultimately lead to unique cutscenes and even different endings. Number 8, Resident Evil 1996. The nightmare that started it all, 1996's Resident Evil. This game 1000% deserves a ton of respect for what it did for the video game landscape, which is why I have it in my top 10. The original game set the tone for what to expect from a good horror game. While it didn't create the survival horror genre, it definitely put it on the map. There's so much to talk about when it comes to this game, but I'll do my best to keep it short and sweet. Resident Evil's most notable feature comes from the setting of the game, the Spencer Mansion. To this day, no game, Resident Evil, or any horror game outside of the series, has come close to how powerful this setting is in terms of the atmospheric horror vibe it gives off. From the eerie hallways full of zombies moaning around the corner to the killer soundtrack that still gives me goosebumps almost 30 years later, the Spencer Mansion is truly the scariest location ever featured in a video game. Franchise veterans were introduced in this game like Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Albert Wesker. The boss fights were nightmare fuel, from giant snakes to giant spiders to giant sharks. Okay, maybe not the most creative bosses of the franchise, but they definitely served their purpose. Inventory management and limited resources was more important in this game than most games that followed it, making it the true survival horror experience. Puzzles were difficult, the set design of each individual room created some of the most iconic and most memorable rooms of the entire series, and the branching narratives, especially in Jill's campaign, added some replayability to an already addicting game. All in all, the original Resident Evil was a masterpiece, and while it doesn't crack the top 5, something tells me this won't be the last time that we talk about the Spencer Mansion and the original Nightmare in today's video. Number 7, Resident Evil 4, 2005. As the highest rated Resident Evil game of all time according to Metacritic, and the fact that this game is argued as one of the best horror games of all time, obviously this game was going to rank really high on today's list. Although I'm pretty confident that some of you are very disappointed with how low I have it. Now look, I love RE4. It's an extremely addicting game that ended up bringing in so many new fans to the series back in 2005. This version of Leon S. Kennedy is the best version of Leon throughout the entire RE franchise, courtesy of the incredible Paul Mercer. That guy is charming, a badass, and delivers incredible one-liners, and he's easily one of the best voice actors of the entire franchise. This game also features some of the best boss fights of the entire series, with my personal favorite boss fight of the entire franchise being in this game, Jack Krauser. The melee mechanics, inventory management, and a fantastic story all makes this game a true masterpiece in its own right. But I'll admit, when this game first came out, I was kind of annoyed. I love the fixed camera angles of Resident Evil, and I've always preferred survival horror over action horror. I felt like RE4 was a complete departure from everything that I loved about the Resident Evil franchise. And while it did grow on me over time, the third-person perspective without the ability to move while aiming hindered the gameplay experience for me to some degree. Add that to the QTEs of the game and the fact that it wasn't as smooth as one other action horror entry of the franchise that we'll talk about later, clearly I was a little hard on this game at first. With that being said, despite me coming into this game expecting myself to completely hate it when I knew it was moving away from traditional Resident Evil, I just couldn't. I just loved every minute of this game, and I found myself replaying it over and over and over again until I just knew every inch of the village, the castle, and even the island. Although honestly, I could do without the constant cries from Ashley. Let's be real for a sec, guys. I'm sure we all could have done without the constant cries from Ashley. Number 6, Resident Evil Code Veronica. Ooh, so this might be the biggest hot take on today's video, but Resident Evil Code Veronica is a much better game than people give it credit for. I get that the visuals are rough even in comparison to other PS2 and Dreamcast games. The dialogue is just horrible even for a classic RE game. Seriously, Steve Burnside is one of my least favorite characters because of how he was depicted in this game. And the difficulty of this game is just insane, as it's arguably the hardest Resident Evil game out there, especially considering that you can't choose an easier difficulty to make things better for yourself. Still, despite those negatives, I really do love replaying the hell out of this game. There are 3 Resident Evil games that I find myself replaying more than any other game out there, and Code Veronica is one of those games. For one, I'm a big fan of Chris Redfield and Claire Redfield. And as of today, this is the only game out there that features both of them front and center. On top of that, I would argue that this is the best version of Claire Redfield in the series, and it's also one of the better versions of Chris, as he shows off his good big brother personality. But let's be real, Code Veronica isn't really great because of its story. The story is kind of all over the place, and it's laughably bad even if it does feature Albert Wesker and Alexia Ashford. No. The true shining moment for this game is just the gameplay as a whole. Whether it's Rockford Island or the Antarctic base, the set pieces are extremely fun to explore and find resources in. Sure, there's a lot of backtracking, probably a little bit too much, but considering the atmosphere of this game makes everything feel tense and terrifying, I'm all for spending so much time in these iconic locations. The soundtrack is arguably one of the best in the series, only behind RE2 in my opinion. Seriously, the save room theme is fire as fuck, and Alexia's boss fight in the mansion, chef's kiss. With new iconic enemies like the Bandersnatches, returning favorites like the Hunters, and the traditional fixed hammer mechanics that adds a certain charm to the game, yeah, I absolutely love Code Veronica. So much so that I worked my ass off a few months ago to beat this game with nothing but a knife on stream. Hard as hell, but extremely rewarding. Number 5, Resident Evil 7. RE7 is truly one of the scariest games I've ever played, especially since I played this game for the first time on my friend's VR, and let me tell you, Mia scarred me for weeks. Even without playing this game on VR though, Resident Evil 7 is truly one of the scariest games of the franchise. After the action-focused RE6, Resident Evil 7 brought the franchise back to its roots, but complete with a new perspective, first person. And thanks to Madhouse mode, Resident Evil 7 could feel more like a traditional survival horror game thanks to the inventory management, limited saves, terrifying environments, and the constant fear of running low on resources that you'll ultimately find yourself wishing you saved that last magnum bullet for the next big bad. Sure, the first-person perspective made the game feel less like your traditional Resident Evil games, but what mattered was the atmospheric horror vibe that the game captured with the setting of the Baker estate. Jack Baker is argued as one of the better stalker enemies of the Resident Evil franchise thanks to the way he would quickly pursue Ethan, the way he mocked Ethan as he chased him, and the fact that it was pretty much hard to keep an eye on him since the game was in first person versus third person. There were moments where I found myself thinking that Jack was ahead of me, so I went a different direction only to run into him by mistake due to a miscalculation on my part. Horrifying. There were some negatives though. The fact that cutscenes can't be skipped really made the game have less replayability, a faceless new protagonist had players being disappointed with Ethan as a character, and the molded creatures of Resident Evil 7 are some of the worst regular enemies of the entire series. However, for every con, there's 3 pros to make up for it. Actually, one thing I didn't mention was the DLCs in RE7. Compared to any other game of the series, RE7 went nuts on delivering us good quality DLCs for the game. From the free-to-play Not a Hero DLC to the epilogue of RE7, End of Zoe, to even random mini-games and escape rooms. Resident Evil 7 truly had a lot of content for all kinds of fans of the Resident Evil franchise. Number 4, Resident Evil 4 2023. Oh my, the RE4 remake haters are about to tear me apart right about now. Listen, I respect anybody that prefers the original Resident Evil 4. Hell, I know there are things that the OG did better, like Leon's personality and Ada's voice actor in the original game. With that being said, I personally prefer most of the features and mechanics introduced in the remake of Resident Evil 4. For me, the remake took everything that I liked about the original game, improved on it, and then took everything that I wasn't a fan of and fixed it. I know the remake has only been out for, about 2 years now, but looking back at how much more fun I have replaying Resident Evil 4 Remake compared to the original, it's hard to deny the fact that I prefer the remake over the original by a long shot. Ignoring all the things that make both games great, like the boss fights, I instead turn my attention towards the changes that really make RE4 Remake more fun in my opinion. The biggest thing is combat. Thanks to the new and improved knife mechanic, combat in Resident Evil has never felt better. Thanks to the new and improved knife mechanic, combat in Resident Evil 4 Remake has never felt better in the Resident Evil franchise. I've always been a big hater on action horror games in the Resident Evil series, but when the gameplay is this fun, it's extremely hard to not appreciate how entertaining this game is. Using the knife for takedowns and blocking attacks makes combat in this game feel so much more satisfying. In fact, the combat in this game has inspired me to play through RE4 Remake this upcoming weekend using only my knife, so yeah, subscribe to the channel and check that out later this weekend. Outside of the gameplay side of things, which is definitely where the remake excels the most, there's other areas that have been improved on as well. Separate ways, while having a $10 price tag this time around feels longer and more expansive. It even features Albert Wesker in person versus the radio calls that we got in the original game. The atmosphere of the game, especially in the castle and in the village after it gets dark, feels like it adds a bit more atmospheric horror to the setting compared to the original game. And all in all, the dialogue is just much better, especially with Ashley Graham, as she received the biggest improvement to the point where I wouldn't mind seeing her return in a future game, which is kind of crazy because I hated her in the original game. I may not be the biggest fan of action horror, but even I can't deny how addicting the gameplay of Resident Evil 4 Remake truly was. Number 3, Resident Evil 2 2019. Of the modern remake trilogy, the 2019 remake of Resident Evil 2 is by far my favorite of the 3. While RE4 Remake is a lot of fun, I can't deny that, RE2 Remake does the best job by remaining loyal to the source material while also improving on it for a modern audience. In fact, I would argue that Resident Evil 2 Remake does the best job of finding the medium ground between classic and new fans of the RE series. To avoid repeating myself later, I'll focus on the things that the remake did differently, both for the better and for the worse. Obviously, the visuals, dialogue, graphics, and set design are a no-brainer. With modern hardware comes improvements to those departments, so I don't really need to cover those areas. What really impressed me about the remake of Resident Evil 2 is how well it handled zombies specifically. One of the biggest fears for remaking classic zombie-focused Resident Evil games like RE2 is the fact that modern controls would make zombies far less threatening than they were in the classics. But I would actually argue that RE2 Remake found a way to make them more intimidating. By turning zombies into bullet sponges that move slightly faster and were more unpredictable with their movements, RE2 Remake made zombies more terrifying than they have ever been in the history of Resident Evil. Shooting off limbs was a new strategy in RE2 Remake that allowed the player to decide what was better, going for headshots or making the zombies immobile or slow. Mr. X, a stalker enemy that was far less intimidating in the original game and only featured in Scenario B of the original game, was front and center in both campaigns, and honestly, he's the scariest stalker enemy in the entire franchise for me right now. Yeah, he even beats Nemesis in OG RE3. And finally, this is probably the most obvious one, but the boss fights of Resident Evil 2 Remake are less one-dimensional than the original game. There's a couple things missing in the remake that unfortunately keep it from being the perfect remake, but all in all, it's still to this day one of my favorite games to play, and it's the best modern remake of the franchise. Well, modern being the key word there, as it's not the best remake technically, which brings me to the next entry. Number 2, Resident Evil 2002 Remake. I could honestly go back and forth between the number 1 entry and the remake of Resident Evil, but for today, I'm going to put the 2002 remake of Resident Evil in the number 2 spot. This game is the perfect remake in my opinion. Unlike most remakes out there, Resident Evil 2002 somehow keeps almost every single element of the original game intact, but adds new and iconic features to the game that somehow makes a masterpiece better. Ignoring things I already said about the Spencer Mansion, because obviously they apply here as well, in fact probably more so with the improved visuals of the game, but Resident Evil 2002 has so much to love, especially as a fan of survival horror. In fact, to this day I would argue that Resident Evil Remake is the best survival horror game of all time, as it captures the true essence of what makes a survival horror game a survival horror game. One of my favorite changes to the game are the Crimson Heads. While zombies are truly terrifying in Resident Evil in their own right, especially in the small and narrow hallways of the Spencer Mansion, the Crimson Heads up the stakes. Now these zombies are faster, stronger, and more dangerous than their slower moving counterparts. This adds a new strategy to the original Nightmare, as now you might avoid killing zombies due to the fear that they'll come back later as a Crimson Head. Lisa Trevor, while not a major presence throughout the game, is a new tragic monster in the remake that follows Jill and Chris throughout certain areas of the Spencer Mansion. New areas like the graveyard and Lisa's cabin were added to the remake. You also got additional lore in the remake. Obviously the remake isn't perfect, with the lack of branching narratives, particularly in Jill's campaign missing and the lack of some of the more iconic lines from the original, like Jill's sandwich, but all in all, I would argue that Resident Evil 2002 might very well be one of the best remakes of all time. Number 1, Resident Evil 2 1998. I'm sorry, but there's no Resident Evil game that I've replayed more than that of the original Resident Evil 2. In fact, I love this game so much that I own multiple different copies of this game, including the PS1, Nintendo 64, and GOG ports of the game. There really is a lot of good things I can say about this game, and I can honestly spend all day just talking about the good things about Resident Evil 2. So here's a rapid fire of everything I love about RE2. The RPD station is a near perfect setting for the Resident Evil game, only behind the Spencer Mansion of the original Nightmare. The soundtrack is without a doubt the best of the entire series. William Birkin and Mr. X are both iconic and memorable villains, especially as we watch Birkin transform every step of the way, slowly losing his humanity. This game features a handful of the most iconic characters in the entire franchise: Leon S. Kennedy, Claire Redfield, Sherry Birkin, and Ada Wong. Even the bonus games are addicting as hell. For Survivor brought the world Hunk, a fan favorite side character, and Extreme Battle Mode is one of the more fun bonus games out there. It even features a never before seen model of Chris Redfield. The Lickers are some of the most terrifying monsters ever seen in the Resident Evil universe, and they were first introduced in this game. I mentioned earlier how the remake left a few things out. Most notably, those missing features are the zapping system and the A and B scenario system. Combined, these features allow players to appreciate the story of Resident Evil 2 not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times. The way it would work is that players could play through scenario A as either Leon or Claire. Then scenario B would allow you to play as the other character from their own perspective of things with different puzzles and a new boss, Mr. X. Then you can flip them around, as there are exclusive interactions and cutscenes that can only be experienced in each playthrough of the game. Again, I could spend all day talking about the pros, so let's just move towards the only negative thing that I could personally come up with: the puzzles. I would argue that Resident Evil 2 perfectly captures most elements that you would expect from a Resident Evil and a survival horror game, except for the lack of puzzles. While there are a handful of them in comparison to both its predecessor and its successor, Resident Evil 2 severely lacks in difficult puzzles, and for that reason, it's the weakest of the trilogy in that department. Still, that's one minor aspect when comparing it to all of the pros and all of the things that does better than those games, including the amount of jump scares. Like, holy shit, does this game have a lot of jump scares in it. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Do you agree with the original Resident Evil 2 game being the best of the franchise? If not, what's your favorite? Do you think Resident Evil Survivor 2 is the worst of the series? If not, what's your least favorite? Let me know all of your opinions down below. Also, I want to thank you guys for watching this video, as this is probably the longest video I've ever done on this channel, as it's going to probably clock in at around an hour long, probably longer. So again, thank you so much if you managed to watch this entire video from start to finish. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's very long topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Games. Take care.